I'm not a racist, preach the teacher. You still they never had this. Number one, them wanna run about the gun. I wasn't licensed to have one. The minute they see me, fear me. I'm the epitome, a public enemy. Use, abuse, without clues. I refuse to blow fuse. They even had it on the news. Don't believe the hype. Don't believe the hype. Don't believe the hype. Back when I wrote y'all, yes.
I imagine if I took your name out of it, took away the awards and the acclaim, took the cover off the book, the publishing house goes away, the content of that section would not be out of place in the backpack of an extremist. So I think the question is central and key. If Israel has a right to exist, and if your answer is no, then I guess the question becomes, why do the Palestinians have a right to exist? Why do 20 different Muslim countries have a right to exist?
My answer is that no country in this world establishes its ability to exist through rights. Countries establish their ability to exist through force.
Well, this week, CBS News executive said this interview failed to meet the network's editorial standards. But some journalists and media critics have actually come out in defense of it, calling the line of questioning just good journalism. Even book reviews have taken a sharp turn. Compact Magazine published a review with the incendiary title, Why Ta-Nehisi Coates Hates Israel. Helen Andrews writes in part, quote, "The problem with Israel is that it shames him. How can it be that the Jews carved their Israel out of the desert, and yet no place in Africa, least of all Liberia, remotely resembles Wakanda?" So,
wow, that was really racist.
That was
pretty racist.
I wanted to start with that because I know that you are trying to.
I'm sorry, I haven't seen that.
I know, and I know that you are not seeing the reviews. I know you're not. You told me that you were not going to see the reviews or read what's going on about this.
I'm actually surprised.
But this one cut through for me, and I wanted to ask you about it because of the fact that in some ways it actually reinforces a lot of what you wrote in your book. But what is your reaction to that?
I mean, she didn't read the book. Because the book is about, essentially, it's a critique of nationalism at large. And it talks about Liberia, like, weirdly enough. I mean, and that, that is what it is. I don't want to get into, policing people's reviews. The thing that catches me is the carved part, right? Because that's exactly what I was talking about. I mean, it is like people say, this is not colonialism, while speaking colonial language. You know what I mean? Like this notion that you carved yourself out of the desert as though, once again, the natural world was somehow empty. There's no one there, to say nothing about this idea of use of force. I mean, it is, I'm sorry, I'm a little stunned.
So I was walking, I've been doing my walks and listening. I have about 30 more minutes of the message left. And I've been slow walking it, literally. I walk fast to work up a sweat, but then I'm listening slowly to the message, Ta-Nehisi Coates' latest book. I love how he describes his books as his children. Beautiful. And then I'm tipping up on realizing why people are so big mad. It's like the last 30 minutes they big mad. And I get it, because it really strikes at the notion of who has a right to live, who has a right to identity, who has a right to claim land, who has a right, and by saying it and myth making is that as we used to celebrate Columbus. I'm old enough to have had Columbus in my history books as the founder of who discovered America. It was in my history books in school. We celebrated Columbus Day. I'm old enough to remember no backlash, parades galore with people celebrating their Italian connection because we all want to belong to greatness. But as I'm listening to Ta-Nehisi, I'm realizing this thing of either why we will never reconcile with each other as people. And I'm saying this with trepidation because the desire to matter, to belong somewhere, to be significant is probably one of the most human. It's right up there with self-preservation, right? I think it's in alignment with, because you have to matter. So if you can hitch your wagon to a Columbus, that's great. I have somebody in my line, but you weren't there when Columbus did whatever he did. And we now know him as probably a despicable figure in history. But now people are fighting, folk in different lands are chopping down his statue with sledgehammer. I mean, it's interesting. 30 years ago, he was celebrated and venerated. You know, it's something. At what point are we going to reconcile with we're all humans who all have the same origin story? We all have the same origin story. And if we can just sit in that for a minute, then all of these lines that we've drawn to separate ourselves, country to country, gender to gender, like it's wild to me, all of the ways in which we contort ourselves to not be with each other when the strength is in our unity, period. We're going to F around and find out, though. So, but I'm listening to the last 30 minutes, and I'm in this part where he's on this tour of the city of David, and he tells the listener or the reader that he came into the city of David as a Muslim like years before. So his entry point into this area of, I think it's Jerusalem, was first as a Muslim, which was a very different, or as an Arab. He came in through the Arab side, and it was completely different than this trip. And he's talking to his guide, and he's talking about, the city of David. And he asks his guide, is this the city where David actually walked? And the guide was like, I don't think David even lived. And I said, ooh. Now, I'm somebody that, I've read the Bible more times than I'd like to admit. And I find David complicated. We like the David and Goliath. As I mentioned to many of you, one of the first books my mother ever bought me was a children's Bible, which I still have. It's big. It's big for me. It's like I was 4 years old. Big Bible. Had very, very light-skinned, melanemic depictions. David and Goliath were in there. Samson and Delilah. I mean, it was a lot of biblical figures. Joseph. And I, as a little girl, that was how I learned about certain Bible books, right? So David is one of these complicated figures where he took down the giant. But then later you read, he set up Bathsheba's husband to go get killed so that he could be with her. And you're like, And then he asked God for forgiveness, lost his first. I mean, there's a lot in that Old Testament. I'm like, David's complicated. But what if David didn't exist? What if Moses didn't exist? Oh, I'm going to say something right now. What if Jesus didn't exist and you call yourself a Christian? Do you, if evidence, if they came back and showed you there was no Jesus or I'm going to do this, Muhammad. This is just for entertainment value. I'm not really saying these things. I'm not saying these things, really. I'm asking a question. What if? Do you examine it? And if it's true, irrefutably true, do you change your view? Or do you double down and get mad at the person that brought the message? And this is, I feel like, where we are right now as a nation, right? As we head headlong into a new election, there are these narratives and these myths that are being pushed and shoved. And some would say, like this channel, or even me, because I'm not going to even speak for any other host but me, like I'm pushing a narrative that's, it's blue no matter who and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no, it's very clear. It's black and white for me. There is one candidate that wants us to not exist, doesn't like us, never has, has a history. Here's the proof. Here's the proof. It's right here. And recent proof. Here's some recent proof. He just said some things. I got the clips. Listen for yourself. Up. And then there's another candidate, whether you know her or not, I believe that I can at least work with her or work against her and not lose my life or my livelihood. I feel like somebody can be pushed into greatness by our willingness to push. Can't push the other guy. It's very simple. Very simple. And then there's a lot of people bringing in a whole bunch of other stuff that has nothing to do with whether or not we can be freer. You think this country is built on blah, blah, blah. Yes, it's got all of that. How do you change it? And that's got to be where we are. But if your identity is sewn into, because what we're dealing with is people have sewn their identity into Trump as if he represents them the way I just mentioned, Jesus, Muhammad, whatever, Moses. If these figures didn't exist, would you still be you? And would you still be able to be great? And would your greatness be rooted in something bigger than yourself if you didn't have those figures to tie yourself to? I'm asking a fundamental question about humanity. And as I'm sitting here every day, Monday through Friday, and some days I get very discouraged when I see the back and forth that goes on, and I have to turn off the noise and, lean into something completely mindless or go to one of the books that I'm reading and escape. I just started reading The Barn, had to put that down. I was getting angry, but I want to get that author on. He comes from a sports background. I want to know why he cared so much about Emmett Till to write a whole book. Like, I'm in. But I'm just like, at what point do we say to ourselves collectively, who are we in the midst of it? And I get it. People need to have an origin story. Those of you who grew up reading comic books, those of you who grew up reading these, these kind of fantasy things, the origin story of the villain and the origin story of the hero. Like, we need to know the source, right? And as people, those of you who have been adopted, some of you struggle. If your parents died before you were, born, or you didn't know your parents, a lot of times maybe you walk through life rudderless or not anchored to something greater than, because there's family history. I have privilege because, I heard from a little girl that I was a hunter. My father did the work to take us back the generations, all the way back to Arthur's Quarters, South Carolina, which was a plantation, which I've actually sat once, touched the soil. I know at least here where I come from, but there's a whole other where I come from that's on another continent. And I get the desire for some people to cut themselves off from that origin story, because for them, Africa, I don't know who my people are. Like, if you're Italian, I'm from Naples, or I'm from, from Sicily, or I'm from, I don't know all of the places in Italy. Rome, I'm from, or if you're Irish, you're from the this or the that. Even when I meet Jamaicans, are you from St. Catharines? Are you from the country? Are you from Kingston or Ocho Rios? You still have place, even though that's not your place. You still got a connection to the place that goes back probably more generations than I do here. But that's a source of pride, right? And if you're German or if you're British, you have these stories that you have to tell your children's children. I'm watching this mindless show, Housewives of Potomac, and there's a new lady on. She works for QVC, and she married a man that's German, and they had a child. And she said, her daughter she's from Detroit, but her daughter was raised to appreciate her German father's lineage and she speaks German, and they got this whole background that they can, talk and, feel good about. And she was like, I have not immersed her in being a Black girl, because maybe phenotypically she doesn't look like a Black girl. Maybe the world won't treat her like a Black girl in 30 years. I don't know what's going on with race. I know it's a made up construct, but here we are, right? Fighting out our own insecurities around identity. And as I'm listening to the message, I see the pushback in the last 30 minutes, because if we have to walk the path that Ta-Nehisi has taken us on, then you're going to have to question some things. What's apartheid? Are we for apartheid or are we against apartheid? I think it's a black and white discussion, right? Either you're for it or you're against it. But if I'm against it, but yet I'm practicing it, then what does that mean? And then how do we examine ourselves? And to not practice it means I'm vulnerable, and I don't want to be vulnerable. As a matter of fact, I'm not going to be vulnerable. So no, we're not going to have that discussion. Matter of fact, I'm going to have a different discussion. And if you bring this up, then I'm going to label you a certain kind of way, or I'm going to say you're anti-me. As opposed to like us having a conversation about humanity and everybody's right to breathe, which I think we should be all having. But we can't have that conversation, because if we do, then somehow somebody will feel not valid or valued. It's so complicated. And I feel like this election is the same thing, right? So people are voting their nationality, or they're voting their connection to. Matter of fact, there's a clip, Smez, of this guy that said this election, 44% of MAGA, they're not voting policies. Even this notion of borders and building a wall and all, it's about preservation of something that was made up to begin with to make you feel a way so that they can abuse and subjugate and oppress people. They created this construct that you bought into, because who wants to be oppressed? So if there are two options, oppressed or oppressor, I believe all of us would choose to be if there are only two choices. Again, when we talk about binary choices, this is how deep it is. You only have two choices. You're either going to be the oppressed or the oppressor. Which side are you on? Most of us, I would venture to say all of us would say, two choices? Yeah, I'm going to be an oppressor. Yep. Not even a question. No, not trying to be oppressed. And so in that role, then, can you be a benevolent oppressor? Like, this is how fundamental this has to be, right? But 44%, this guy said, and I'm going to play the clip, said are voting this very notion. You don't have health care, you don't have education, but you are voting your nationality because then you could tell your children that they're somebody. And that's all you care about is your legacy at that point. But it's wild. But what about it? Nobody else deserves to have a legacy? Like, is this where we are? Is that? And I think if you press people, they would say, yeah, nobody but me and mine deserve this. And I think even if we're talking to some black people, nobody but me and mine, I don't care about these Africans or these Haitians. But it's very, to me, very black and white. So there we are. All right, Smith, play that clip.
This scandal won't hurt Trump?
Well, it won't, in that, and we've seen all along that, as he said back in 2015, he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and he wouldn't lose any support. It's not about his qualifications, moral fitness or anything. Donald Trump is the champion of the notion that this should fundamentally be a white country. And as long as he upholds that standard, he will always, as Cornell was talking before, he was never going to fall below 44% of the people in this country because we remain in this existential fight around the nature of the country. And all these other issues are kind of noise to a certain extent. And that's why you see the polls only moving a little bit.
Chairman Steele, what do you think?
No, I agree with that completely, John. I think that is the absolute correct analysis of this moment. And this moment is not what we're talking about right now. This moment is the period 2015 to the present day and ongoing. This has been something that has been brewing within our country since the 1930s, certainly within the Republican Party, and it's been an existential battle within the party at various times.
That was Michael Steele, of course, Jonathan Capehart, former colleague of mine at the New York Daily News, and Steve Phillips having a conversation on Jonathan's show. And I would, Michael Steele, go back to the 1830s, not just the 1930s, sir, because if people, the majority of people who follow this MAGA ideology are going to vote for Trump because they are voting for themselves. They're voting for their race or the preservation of that. There's nothing that man will do that will stop them from voting.
My days are cooler, nights are warmer, and I put the blame on you. Time moves slow, but my heart beats faster. When these eyes are looking right at you, you give me something to believe.